The Crystal Cave by Mary Stewart, Book 4, The Red Dragon, 4. It seemed to me that what the messenger had told me, that Ambrosius had been right in his decision. It seemed to me, from what the messenger had told me, that Ambrosius had been right in his decision to make an end of Vortigern before turning on the Saxons. His reduction of Daward and the savagery with which he did it had that effect. Those of the invading Saxons who had ventured furthest inland began to withdraw northwards toward the wild, debatable lands, which had always provided a beachhead for invasion. They halted north of the Humber to fortify themselves where they could and wait for him. At first, Hengist believed that Ambrosius had at his command little more than the Breton invading army, and he was ignorant of the nature of that deadly weapon of war. He thought, it was reported, that very few of the island British had joined Ambrosius. In any case, the Saxons had defeated the British in their small tribal forces so often that they despised them as easy meat. But now, as reports reached the Saxon leader of the thousands who had flocked to the Red Dragon, and of the success at Daward, he decided to remain no longer fortified north of the Humber, but to march swiftly south again to meet the British at a place of his own choosing, where he might surprise Ambrosius and destroy his army. Once again Ambrosius moved with Caesar-like speed. This was necessary because, where the Saxons had withdrawn, they had laid the country waste. The end came in the second week of May, a hot week with sunshine that seemed to come from June, and interrupted by showers left over from April. A borrowed week, and, for the Saxons, a debt called in by fate. Hengist, with his preparations half complete, was caught by Ambrosius at Maesbelay, near Conan's fort, or Caer Conan, that men sometimes call Conisburg. This is a hilly place, with the fort on a crag and a deep ravine running by. Here the Saxons had tried to prepare an ambush for Ambrosius's force, but Ambrosius's scouts got news of it from a Briton they came across lurking in a hilltop cave, where he had fled to keep his woman and 2 small children from the axes of the Northmen. So Ambrosius, forewarned, increased the speed of his march and caught up with Hengist before the ambush could be fully laid, thus forcing him into open battle. Hengist's attempt to lay an ambush had turned the luck against him. Ambrosius, where he halted and deployed his army, had the advantage of the land. His main force, Bretons, Gauls, and the inland British from the south and the southwest, waited on a gentle hill, with a level field ahead over which they could attack unimpeded. Among those troops, medley-wise, were other naive British who had joined him, with their leaders. Behind this main army, the ground rose gently, broken only by breaks of thorn and yellow gorse, in a long ridge which curved to the west in a series of low rocky hills, and on the east was thickly forested with oak. The men from Wales, mountainy men, were stationed mainly on the wings. The North Welsh in the oak forest, and separated from them by the full body of Ambrosius's army. The South Welsh on the hill to the west. These forces, lightly armed, highly mobile, with scores to settle, were to hold themselves in readiness as reinforcements, the swift hammer blows which could be directed during battle at the weakest points of the enemy's defence. They could also be relied upon to catch and cut down any of Hengist's Saxons who broke and fled the field. The Saxons, caught in their own trap with this immense winged force in front of them, and behind them the rock of Caer Conan and the narrow defile where the ambush had been planned, fought like demons, but they were at a disadvantage. They started afraid of Ambrosius's reputation, of his recent ferocious victory at Daward, and more than both, so men told me, of my prophecy to Vortigern, which had spread from mouth to mouth as quickly as the fires in Daward Tower. And of course the omens worked the other way for Ambrosius. Battle was joined shortly before noon, and by sunset it was all over. I saw it all. It was my first great battlefield, and I am not ashamed that it was almost my last. My battles were not fought with sword and spear, if it comes to that. I had already been I had already had a hand in the winning of Caer Conan before I ever reached it. And when I did reach it, was to find myself playing the very part that Uther had once, in jest, assigned to me. I had ridden with Cadel as far as Caerleon, where we found a small body of Ambrosius's troops in possession of the fortress, and another on its way to invest the repair at the fort at Meridunum. I had ridden with Cadel as far as Caerleon, where we found a small body of Ambrosius's troops in possession of the fortress, and another on its way to invest and repair the fort at Meridunum. Also, their officer told me confidentially to make sure that the Christian community, all the community, he added gravely, with the ghost of a wink at me, such as the commander's piety, remained safe. He had been detailed, moreover, to send some of his men back with me to escort me to Ambrosius. My father had even thought to send some of my clothes, so I sent Cadel back, to his disgust, to do what he could with Gallipus's cave and await me there. Then myself rode northeast with the escort. We came up with the army just outside Caer Conan. The troops were already deployed for battle, and there was no question of seeing the commander. So we withdrew as instructed to the western hill, where the men of the South Welsh tribes eyed one another distrustfully over swords held ready for the Saxons below. The men of my escort troop eyed me in something of the same manner. They had not intruded on my silence on the ride, and it was plain they held me in some awe, not only as Ambrosius's acknowledged son, but as Vortigern's prophet, a title which had already stuck to me, and which it took some years to shed. When I had reported with them to the officer in charge, and asked him to assign me to a place in his troop, he was horrified, and begged me quite seriously to stay out of the fight, but to find some place where the men could see me, and know, as he put it, that the prophet was here with them. In the end, I did as he wished, and withdrew to the top of a small rocky crag, hard by where, wrapping my cloak about me, I prepared to watch the battlefield spread out below like a moving map. Ambrosius himself was in the center. I could see the white stallion with the red dragon glimmering above it. Out to the right, Uther's blue cloak glinted as his horse cantered along the lines. The leader of the left wing I did not immediately recognize, a grey horse, a big, heavy-built figure striding it. The standard bearing some device in white which I could not at first distinguish. Then I saw what it was. A boar. The boar of Cornwall. Ambrosius's commander of the left was none other than the greybeard Gorlois, lord of Tintagel. Nothing could be read of the order in which the Saxons had assembled. All my life I had heard of the ferocity of these great blood giants, and all British children were brought up from babyhood on stories of their terror. They went mad in war, men said, and could fight bleeding from a dozen wounds, with no apparent lessening of strength or ferocity. And what they had in strength and cruelty they lacked in discipline. This seemed indeed to be so. There was no order that I could see in the vast surge of glinting metal and tossing horsehair which was perpetually on the move, like a flood waiting for the dam to break. But from the distance I could pick out Hengist and his brother, giants with long mustaches sweeping down their chests, the long hair flying as they spurred their shaggy, tough little horses up and down the ranks. They were shouting, and echoes of the shouts came clearly, prayers to the gods, vows, exhortations, commands, which rode towards a ferocious crescendo, till, on the last wild shout of "Kill, kill, kill," the axe heads swung, glinting in the May sunlight, and the pack surged forward toward the ordered lines of Ambrosius's army. The two hosts met with a shock that sent the jackdaws squalling up from Caer Conan, and seemed to splinter the very air. It was impossible, even from my point of vantage, to see which way the fight, or rather, the several different movements of the fight, was going. At one moment it seemed as if the Saxons, with their axes and winged helms, were boring away into the British host. At the next, you would see a knot of Saxons cut off in a sea of British, and then, apparently engulfed, vanish. Ambrosius's centre block met the main stalk of the charge. Then Uther's cavalry, with a swift flanking movement, came in from the east. The men of Cornwall under Golorus held back at first, but as soon as the Saxons' front line began to waver, they came in like a hammer blow from the left and smashed it apart. After that, the field broke up into chaos. Everywhere men were fighting, in small groups or even singly, and hand to hand. The noise, the clash, the shouting, even the smell of sweat and blood mingled, seemed to come to this high perch where I sat with my cloak about me, watching. Immediately below me I was conscious of the stirring and muttering of the Welshmen. Then the sudden cheer as a troop of Saxons broke and galloped in our direction. In a moment the hilltop was empty, save for me, only that the clamour seemed to have washed nearer, round the foot of the hill like a tide coming fast. A robin lighted on a blackthorn at my elbow and began to sing. The sound came high and sweet and uncaring through all the noise of battle. To this day, whenever I think of the battle of Caer Conan, it brings to mind a robin's song mingled with the croaking of the ravens, for they were already circling high overhead. Men say they can hear the clash of swords 10 miles off. It was finished by sunset. Eldol, Duke of Gloucester, dragged Hengist from his horse under the very walls of Caer Conan, to which he had turned to flee, and the rest of the Saxons broke and fled, some to escape, but many to be cut down in the hills, or the narrow defile at the foot of Caer Conan. At first dusk, torches were lit at the gate of the fortress. The gates were thrown open, and Ambrosius's white stallion paced across the bridge and into the stronghold, leaving the field to the ravens, the priests, and the burial parties. I did not seek him straight away. Let him bury his dead and clear the fortress. There was work for me down there among the wounded, and besides, there was no hurry now to give him my mother's message. While I had sat there in the May sunlight between the robin's song and the crash of battle, I knew that she had sickened again and was already dead. And that's the end of chapter 4.